All right, guys, welcome to a science video with me, Mr. Densley. Okay, hopefully all is going well, doing things virtually. This is a photosynthesis video. We watched another one last time in class. We'll continue looking at the process of photosynthesis and specifically how it allows organisms to capture and store energy. At the end, we'll focus on a skill which will be supporting a scientific claim. Okay, so what are we going to learn? In this video, we'll learn three main things. Thing number one is what is a chlorophyll's role in boosting electron energy levels. The second one is how do photosystem 1 and 2, PS1 and PS2, work together to create a proton gradient which facilitates ATP synthesis. And then the last one is how are the products of the light-dependent reactions in photosynthesis used in the Calvin cycle. Okay, so this is a graph showing just broad wavelength of visible light and how it's absorbed by chloroplasts. Chlorophyll is the pigment that absorbs the energy, and so that's essentially its job, is to capture sunlight and convert it to high energy electrons. So once these light energy is absorbed, the electrons get excited, they get energized, and the energy from the electrons will essentially produce a gradient, a proton gradient, to make NADPH. Okay, photosystems 1 and 2 are embedded into the internal membranes of the chloroplast, and the thylakoid membrane is what that's called. And you can see them here on this image. So we have PS1 and PS2 right here. But what is a photosystem? Okay, a photosystem is essentially a unit that captures light in a chloroplast's thylakoid membrane. So now we have blue box around these. So here it is again, photosystem 2, photosystem 1, and yes, it does go 2 and then 1 in this process. We talked about hydrolysis last time. So why is hydrolysis of water necessary? Well, the hydrogen molecules from the water are split off during this excitement time when we're energizing electrons. And those hydrogen ions essentially build up an electrochemical proton gradient inside of the thylakoid membrane. So that's what this is showing here. We have water that gets split, and we keep the hydrogen. We're going to end up getting rid of the oxygen later on. Okay. So when electrons are transferred between molecules in reaction, they pass through the electron transport chain. And essentially that's just this chain of different steps along the way, ultimately to create ATP and NADPH. So how are these photosystems functionally related to the electron transport chain, or the ETC? Well, they pass high energy electrons to the electron transport chain. That's literally their job. Light charges up the electron, gets excited, and then it passes it on. I also talked about an electrochemical proton gradient. Essentially, it's a difference in concentration of protons on either side of the membrane. So we want a high concentration inside, low concentration outside. I'll tell you why. So this proton gradient is linked to producing ATP, or the synthesis of ATP. It's used in a passive transport, so just simple diffusion of these protons through a enzyme, through this enzyme, this ATP synthase here. So we're building up lots of hydrogen ions, big concentration, passes through the ATP synthase, and ultimately the ATP synthase is an enzyme, and its job is to make ATP, thus ATP synthase. Okay, so that's what's going on right here. So this part kind of twists and spins and then takes the ADP and adds the phosphorus, and now we have ATP again. Okay, so the energy captured in the light powers the production of carbohydrates in the Calvin cycle. Calvin cycle is going to use three things: ATP, NADPH, and CO2, carbon dioxide, to produce carbohydrates. So over here you can see both of those chemicals being used. ATP becomes ADP, then this goes back to the light reactions. NADPH becomes NADP, and then also we have an input of carbon dioxide. The ultimate goal of the Calvin cycle is to produce organic products that the plant needs to grow, to survive, to store energy. And so that's ultimately the goal of the Calvin cycle is to produce sugar or other organic products. Carbon dioxide, where do plants get it? From the environment. Most plants absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through their leaves, and they just incorporate that into the Calvin cycle. Okay. All right, so now we're going to practice. This is argumentation. We're going to support a claim with evidence from biological principles, concepts, processes, and or data. So here it is, skill practice argumentation. A researcher claims that a certain herbicide suppresses plant growth by inhibiting chloroplast function. To test the claim, the researcher treats isolated chloroplasts with increasing concentrations of the herbicide. The data from the experiment are presented in Table 1, and that's right here. So you'll want to pause and you want to look at that. We want to know which of the following statements best describes the results that we see here. So we have the concentration, we have the pH difference, and ATP production. So pause the video and see what you think. All right, we're back. Okay, so what do you think? A, B, C, D? B. There you go. Boom. ATP synthase activity depends on a proton gradient across the thylakoid membrane. So now let's look at that. We have to understand, what is pH? What does pH mean? pH means percent hydrogen. So if we're thinking back to what we talked about, this electrochemical proton gradient, the more difference there is, or the higher pH difference across the membrane, we would think that the more ATP should be produced. So if we're not using any herbicide, that means that the plant is healthy, the chloroplast function is going perfectly. There's a pretty high pH difference, so it's a 3.5 pH difference across the thylakoid membrane, and we're producing very high amounts of ATP. Whereas we increase the herbicide to 2 micrograms per liter, our pH difference goes down and ATP production goes down. We increase the herbicide concentration again, pH difference continues to go down, ATP production is now very low, and we just crank it up, just blast this thing with herbicides, and there's no difference because the chloroplasts aren't functioning anymore. There's not this gradient anymore, and we're not producing very much ATP. So there we go. This is essentially that. So we'll continue on. We'll do a quick recap of this video. The 3 main takeaways are, number 1, chlorophyll captures energy from sunlight and excites the electrons. Okay, the second thing is, as electrons are passed through the electron transport chain, proteins are actively transported across the membrane, establishing a gradient. Protons diffuse through ATP synthase, powering ATP synthesis. ATP, NADPH, and carbon dioxide are used in the Calvin cycle to produce carbohydrates through a series of reactions. Okay, that's it. It was really quick. Thanks for watching. Pause it, rewind it, go through it again. There will be a quiz for you in Canvas, and that is it. We'll see you next time. Later.